Hello, and thanks for joining our weekly webinar series on marketing automation and campaign execution. This is Scott Dill with Real Story Group and our company founder and CEO, Tony Byrne.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Really excited to be here today with you all. It's an interesting marketplace. You know, we've been covering it for about 10 years. Just over the past month or so, we've updated the structure of our vendor evaluations, revised the scenarios, and kind of modernized some of the things that we were doing as we saw you modernizing what you're doing with these tools. And so it's a really exciting and really interesting time to talk about it. So just a little background for those of you who are unfamiliar with Real Story Group. I founded the company 18 years ago, based really on this quadrant you see on the left. I was working at a systems integrator, and we were implementing tools that were in the so-called top right-hand quadrant of these analyst reports. And we realized that there were a lot of problems with these tools. And then we figured out how these quadrants actually got built and thought, well, there's got to be a better way of evaluating vendors rather than just kind of throwing these big names against a matrix like this. So I decided to found the Real Story Group to do what more unusually critical and hard-hitting evaluations. And to do that, we really needed to follow a pretty strict independence regime that's really quite unique in the analyst space, which is that we never consult to vendors, we never speak at their events, accept hospitality for us, they can't buy us a coffee, we certainly never write white papers for them. And so that means that that's given us a lot of freedom to tell the real story, including on some of the larger name vendors, really being clear with you about what their inevitable weaknesses are and not just what their strengths are. So we evaluate technologies now across 7 different marketplaces, soon to be 9. We call this the omni-channel stack vendor map. Now, of course, a vendor can't be omni-channel. Certainly a platform's not omni-channel, but you can build an omni-channel stack out of a collection of tools. Today, we're going to be looking at the marketing automation campaign execution line. That's the sort of brown line here, and you'll see it runs through the city center with some of the big name vendors, but also a number of other vendors as well. And it'll be touching, of course, on some of the other subway lines here as well, particularly around web content and experience management, certainly customer data platforms in orange, an important theme here. And then we'll wrap up talking a little bit about journey orchestration engines, which is the light purple line, as they relate to marketing automation campaign execution. Okay, so let's go into it. First, how did we get here? And I think that, a number of you have been building MarTech stacks that look like this. You have major channels at the top where you're talking to customers and prospects, a variety of production and interaction and intermediation services happening in the middle in the gray area. And many of you have made or are making significant investments in that. And then there's this sort of colored area, which is in a way historically been kind of the agenda here, the multicolored area, which we call the content and engagement management tier, where, we have major systems for content and interaction and services that are driving these customer experiences. And I think most of us have been spending the last 5 to 10 years really modernizing that layer of our stack. And now we're in kind of late stage of modernization. We'll put a lot of effort into customizing our WCM tools, our marketing automation and email service provider environment, certainly CRM and Salesforce automation, often investing in major vendor platforms there, doing heavy customizations and integration. But along the way, we're also, I think, still trying to figure out how to integrate, particularly marketing automation and campaigns and offers with sales, with support, with our websites. We've got a lot of one-to-one integrations, but still one of the major challenges that we face, both ourselves with our own stacks, and then certainly I think we're seeing vendors struggling to do this as well. And there's some particular issues here around some things that have happened at IBM that I think are also fairly germane. But the story really coming into 2019 has been a story about modernization, investment, and enhancement. And, we've gotten pretty good at this within these individual silos. I think there's an open question about what's happening across these different silos, and I'll be getting into that in a minute or two. But the reality is for many organizations, marketing automation campaign execution is really important. So this is an example of a major the stack that, we customized for a major advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. And every morning they send out 2 to 3 million emails, right, with a variety of different calls to action. So, in that kind of an environment, their marketing automation platform really became the core of their stack and really the center dominant player. And they made sure that then their web content management system would work with it and that their social engagement worked off it. And so, for many of you, marketing automation campaign execution is definitely a must-have. You've got to do it right. And the point here is that for some of you, it's really at the center of your MarTech stack. And so it's really important that you've got the right tools and it's working effectively for you there. When you're looking at this technology, one thing that, is always important is to look at it in terms of actual scenarios. And so in our judgment, scenarios are always going to be decisive, certainly in how Real Story Group evaluates these. So here's a look at 2 players in this space, Acton and Vuture, and sort of how they compare. But let's talk about these scenarios for a second, because I think there's some lessons here. First is that B2B versus B2C still really matters, that a number of these systems are geared towards B2B. We have smaller lists, but more kind of nurturing and drip campaigns. B2C, where you have larger lists, usually of existing customers, where a lot of it is around offer management and retention and other sorts of things. And then there's a whole set of potentially multi-channel scenarios as well. And so for B2B, it breaks down between mid-sized enterprise marketing automation platform and large enterprise marketing automation. And so in a large enterprise, typically you see multiple lists, multiple different users. So you've got to have entitlements and security really carefully locked down, often global environments, a lot of different marketing departments potentially accessing it. Often the prospect and customer data resides elsewhere and you're sending customer data objects. So it's very different than more mid-size, which tends to be more straightforward marketing automation, where you have a number of services all in one environment and where ease of use really becomes the key factor. Account-based marketing, of course, increasingly important in the B2B space. Some of these vendors incorporate those services, others don't or partner with others. In B2C, again, you've got a similar bifurcation between the needs of very large enterprise and more mid-sized enterprise. The kind of tool sets and performance and security and other issues tend to be very different between those. And then, of course, dynamic offer management, increasingly important capabilities, sometimes within these systems, sometimes not. I noticed the third category of scenarios is multi-channel. And so some of these platforms will do other outbound services, so around mobile push, social publishing, and some degree of orchestration. What we find with these marketing automation and campaign execution platforms is they're not truly omni-channel, that they tend not to be able to support journeys that don't revolve primarily around some sort of messaging that they're going to be doing themselves. And so I've got a little thinking on that a little bit later in this deck as well. So again, these scenarios are important. So for example, this large advocacy organization, Washington, D.C., they really found themselves centered on this kind of middle use case here, large enterprise B2C, right? So high volume, being able to generate dynamic messages based on the customer profile. And mobile push was not a big deal for them, but social publishing was. They wanted to also do some social publishing in this platform. So those were the 2 scenarios that ultimately drove them to their shortlist. Whereas working with another large telco that worked primarily with small businesses, for them, it was definitely a large enterprise marketing automation platform they were looking for. They had a lot of different products and business units. They need to be very careful about how all these messages were orchestrated. They were not all that interested in account-based marketing because very often there was just a single decision maker at their customers. And so that was less of a deal for them. But certainly the large enterprise map and the mobile push were 2 really important scenarios for them in just getting to their short list. So it's a maxim at RSG. You should always look at scenarios when you're evaluating vendors. That's what we do in our research to generate charts like this. So this chart was just a screen capture from our real-time application where you can line up different vendors and compare them head to head. Or you can use the so-called real quadrant generator, which goes the other way around. You pick what are the scenarios that are really important to you, and then it tells you which vendors are best at achieving those scenarios. So you can feel free to try out some of those tools as you come back to Real Story Group after the end of this webinar. Let's talk about the vendors then. Like many marketplaces, it divides into some of the big suite vendors who have major digital marketing platforms that subsume this technology, and then there's more dedicated marketing automation platforms, email service provider solutions, and you'll see that several vendors have both of these, right? And so that makes things a little bit more complicated for you, the customer. A lot of change happening in this space. The digital marketing platforms, you probably know that IBM has sold almost its entire marketing portfolio to a private equity firm. Have some thoughts on that in the next slide. ExactTarget, the ExactTarget Marketing Cloud, still quite distinct from the rest of Salesforce, but has subsumed a number of other Salesforce acquisitions and now has about 10 or 11 different studio products. Adobe, primarily around campaign, but also some other interesting data tools coming into that environment. But then Adobe, if you look below, it's also acquired Marketo for B2B. Salesforce has Pardot. IBM has or had the Watson, so-called WCA, the former SilverPop, Primo back in play here. Microsoft, having exited this marketplace, has now come back in the last year, somewhat puzzlingly, with a fairly upstart solution that's still somewhat under construction. So, you have this kind of upper tier and mid tier, sometimes even within the same vendor. But what's pushing all of these guys is certainly there's underneath this for small businesses and small to medium-sized businesses a whole raft of, I think, close to 90 different solutions that can provide marketing automation or email service provider platforms. And so, this came from Chief Martech Scott Brinker's famous mega infographic of now 9,000 different solutions. And this is just a marketing automation and campaign lead management space. And, there are among these, I think more than 100 different vendors, maybe close to 200 even on this. So it's a highly fragmented space once you get beyond the major players. And so that's really important for you to understand, particularly if you're more of a small to mid-sized business. There's a number of players competing here, in many cases on newer technologies and also, quite frankly, just lower costs if your needs are not particularly complicated. So a lot of movement at the kind of lower end of this market. But let's talk about the upper end, which is pretty interesting. And I know many of you kind of just default to some of these major suites like Eloqua, Salesforce, Adobe, and others. And I think that the recent IBM move is significant here. So I'll talk about that in a second. First, I'll remind you that if you have any questions at all or anything you disagree with, feel free to ask in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll take your questions as is, or certainly there's time at the end. So Dharmendra, to answer your question, MAP does equal marketing automation platform, and ESP equals email service provider, right? So basically kind of a batch and blast system that's typically associated with B2C operations. So you could think of Adobe Campaign as kind of the high-end ESP. Okay. Earlier this month, IBM announced that it was selling off its entire marketing and, in fact, e-commerce portfolio as well to a private equity firm called Centerbridge. We tend to think this is not a good thing for IBM customers because, in all likelihood, whatever this private equity firm says, in all likelihood, what they are more likely to do is try to coast off the existing maintenance revenue rather than make major changes to the platforms itself. And so what were some of the key takeaways here for you as a customer? Well, first of all, Watson, specifically the cognitive-oriented AI, was really no savior. I mean, IBM rebranded all of this stuff Watson, but what was interesting was how few Watson services they actually injected into their marketing portfolio. certainly within Watson Campaign Automation, the former Silverpop, all they ever did with Watson after renaming it several years ago was, update the CSS and then put in this Watson generated help for some of the users in the system. Now, help is useful, but it's certainly not a game changer. So this may be a harbinger that there's less than meets the eye when it comes to artificial intelligence and machine learning in these platforms. Certainly something to look at. I think we could say that AI and ML itself is likely not a savior in this space. Interesting technology. Vendors are still experimenting with it. The other big one here that I think IBM experienced is that it's really hard to align all these moving pieces across a suite. So IBM had maybe 32 different SKUs. And it can be very difficult for these large vendors who nominally are trying to sell you an integrated solution to keep all those pieces moving in a single direction. Many of them also with legacy customer bases that they have to support. And I think there's an open question about whether, big MarTech really has a future in that regard, that I can go with a single vendor and have them carry me into the future. Maybe that strategy carries me into the past. And the other lesson here was hybrid cloud isn't enough. I think that was IBM's other big selling point, was that they could do a lot of hybrid or help transition you from on-prem to the cloud. Clearly, that wasn't enough of runway for them. And part of that is that native cloud microservices is much easier and cheaper to maintain, patch, and upgrade. And so I think IBM was getting out innovated. I think this can be happening to some of the other players, including Oracle and Adobe and Salesforce as well. And so let's look at them. I think at some level, they all suffer, maybe not to the same degree, but from some of the similar challenges that IBM is experiencing, particularly around technical debt and particularly around integration among their different solutions. And I think that this, in conjunction with some other things that are happening in the omnichannel world, makes it a good time to reconsider your investments here. And in particular, whether you might be able to downshift to a simpler solution that's potentially also a more modern solution and potentially a lower cost solution. And I think what's accelerating this is part of a broader trend for once you get beyond the MarTech stack that you saw earlier, you really want to be, if you care about customer experience and quality, coherent customer experiences across touch points, you really want to be thinking about a more omni-channel technology stack model. And so what this introduces in the bottom layer here is a whole set of what we call enterprise foundation services. So this is an attempt to take some of the decisions and data and services and collaboration and extract them from these different engagement silos and make them available enterprise-wide. And there's a lot of implications around this. So most importantly, I think what it means is that key services move lower in your stack. So at the channel-specific layer, including email and marketing automation, you're primarily managing outbound messaging. You still use that for contextualization, assembly, delivery, and some forms of interaction, right? And maybe tracking some of those interactions. But what's happening is that your core data, your core content, insights, orchestration, personalization gets pushed lower in your stack in this model. And particularly what this means is that your email and marketing automation platform no longer is where you have your decisive campaign and journey decisions, because you want to be able to have those really affect all the different customer touch points. You don't use it as a content platform, that you have your base themes and assets living lower and not in your marketing automation platform. You've taken out your customer data into some sort of a customer data platform. And you're doing, your analytics as well at a more enterprise level. So at this point, these different platforms here, CRM, social engagement, email marketing automation, WCM, they become more order takers rather than decision or intelligent platforms. And so I think this is an opportunity then to essentially take some of the complexity away from your email and marketing automation platform, focus less on trying to integrate it laterally and more move that data and decisions lower in your stack. And your email and marketing automation platform provider becomes more of just a kind of a delivery engine. And that could be an opportunity for you to simplify at that tier and potentially reduce some costs there. In particular, I think a number of things that we might be asking our marketing automation and email service provider tools to do with respect to orchestration may be better done by Journey orchestration engines. So this is some new vendor evaluations that Real Story Group has just put out this week with an evaluation of 13 key vendors in this space. And so Journey orchestration engines do similar things that you might be doing in a campaign, now more outbound oriented campaign suite, but the idea is that they talk to all of your different customer touch points. So they may watch and learn what's happening and then in your existing environments, and then you start planning and mapping different sorts of engagements. You activate and view what's happening and then analyze and optimize these journeys and programs. There's 6 different key use cases for this, much the same way that there's 9 key use cases for marketing automation, campaign execution. For this segment, we have 6 key scenarios that we evaluate the vendors. Really interesting to see where they specialize and where they don't. Again, it's a marketplace of suite vendors and pure play. Some of the major suite vendors are really struggling here because they're trying to do it off their marketing automation or campaign management platforms, and they turn out to have too narrow a scope. Some BPM vendors down here that have a very marketing oriented, like Pega, BPM Online, Infor, and to some extent Teradata, also have some interesting solutions in this place. Potentially some of the more robust solutions, although they do lock you in at some level to some of their broader marketing platforms. So you may not, there's definitely some cautions there. And then a whole set of pure play vendors as well. So really interesting space. Encourage you to go to our site and download a sample and see what you think about whether you're ready to invest in this tier of technology as well. So at Real Story Group, we work for this person on the left. We call her Stacy, the omni-channel stack owner. She's got a lot of questions coming at her all day. We try to serve as kind of a force field for her in terms of helping her give good answers to all these questions and make good decisions about her stack. So if you recognize this person and you would like a trusted advisor as well, feel free to reach out to us. 3 different ways you can work with Real Story Group. About half our subscribers just sign on because they have a vendor selection process going on and some key technology where they're going to be making a significant investment, and they want the real story on the vendor strengths and weaknesses and some guidance about what's the right shortlist. And so we inform and empower tech selection teams with our usually critical research and candidate advice. But the other half of our subscribers are sign on really to the full slate of research and advisory services that we have. We call this the Omni-Channel Stack Advisory, and that's where we advise Stacy and her peers on an ongoing basis. Some of them are coming together now as an optional add-on to that to form an executive leadership council for stack owners, where we're going to be hosting regular confidential in-person meetings so that you can work with your peers and learn lessons in kind of a safe environment about what's working well and what's not working well. So would love to stay in touch. It looks like a few questions have come in. Scott, if you want to just talk real briefly about next steps, and then we'll get to those questions. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the GoToWebinar control panel.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. And yes, please do enter in any questions or feedback that you might have. We invite you to go to our site and take a look at samples from each of our research areas. And if you'd like to see a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience, just drop us a line at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to schedule a quick 20 to 30-minute overview of what will be available to you as a subscriber. You can also actually try out the tools on your own. Just go to realstorygroup.com/tools. We do have another webinar coming up next week, which we invite you to attend. As Tony mentioned, we'll be talking a little bit more about Stacy, the stack owner, during that presentation. So that'll be a week from today at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern. So we certainly encourage you to take a look at our site and join us for that presentation. Does look like there are a couple questions, Tony. If you can, you want to take those away?
Sure. So the first one is from David, and David, thanks for writing in. He's disagreeing about the IBM sell-off to Centerbridge, and he's saying, it seems you didn't understand what's happening with IBM selling to Centerbridge. At the opposite, a kind of spin-off company will be created with much more investment and money that IBM was putting into the solution. It's good news for WCA customers. Centerbridge will put money into the new company to sell it later on, like it was done with Marketo before. So that's, best case scenario, David. Just call me a skeptic on this. I think that there's a pretty big difference between the rather motley collection of tools that Centerbridge acquired from IBM and the point solution around Marketo, which to be sure had kind of stalled in the marketplace, but was a much more modern cloud-native offering, was probably suffering more from bad management than anything else, and was relatively much more easy to turn around. I have significant doubts about this collection of tools, which was, in a sense, a kind of an asset sale, essentially a kind of a fire sale from IBM. A lot of technical debt, a lot of difficulties around IntraSuite integration, a lot of issues around the way AI was being done. This is going to be very, very difficult tool set to modernize, and I don't think it was just a question of poor management and the lack of resources. I think that there were some significant liabilities here. I think there are some similar liabilities under the cover with Adobe, Salesforce, and Oracle as well. And so I, of course, wish the best for the IBM customers, but my suspicion is that when the new owners really get behind the wheels of this, they're likely to pick a couple of winners to build on, probably rationalize a fair bit of the stack, and it's going to be substantial change for existing customers without necessarily the reasonable promise of dramatic enhancements or modernization. So I still remain somewhat bearish on this, and our recommendation would not to be that these tools are presently too high risk for anyone new to this marketplace. In other words, if you're out looking for a new marketing automation platform or a new e-commerce platform. So I guess I will respectfully disagree with you there, but we'll see whether the marketplace ends up proving me wrong or not. The other question is from Erica, who's asking about Microsoft sort of reappearing on this landscape. Yeah, it's interesting. Microsoft has always kept its dynamic CRM. It's been a key player in that marketplace, a key alternative to Salesforce, very important for the Microsoft channel as well, which is important to Redmond. But I think that Microsoft was under the misimpression that they could just sort of outsource a lot of their marketing technology, promotion to their customers basically to Adobe and go in with an Adobe partner. And they probably realized too late that Adobe is, in a sense, a kind of a difficult partner for Microsoft because it addresses really only the very top part of the Microsoft customer base, the very largest enterprises, whereas Microsoft has tremendous push in the mid-market where Adobe just doesn't really have much of a story. So I think that had them going back into the Dynamics ecosystem and developing some email and marketing automation tooling. Like I say, it's relatively young and a little bit underbaked. We're in the process of evaluating it and should have our vendor evaluation out in the next a month or so. Okay, so we've reached the bottom of the half hour. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining in. Look forward to having you join my colleague Jared 8 days from now when we'll have the next webinar. And so for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne at Real Story Group. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye now.